Hello and welcome to the Car Care Nut channel. So, tire pressure monitoring system or tire pressure system, or the annoying flashing light or on light that nobody understands how it works and it costs a lot of money to figure out what's going on. In this video, I'm going to explain to you everything you need to know about the tire pressure monitoring system in modern Toyotas. Everything from diagnosis, from how it works, from everything that I've learned about it through my long career as a master diagnostic technician at a Toyota dealership. But before we get started, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. If you're a returning subscriber, thank you so much for watching another one of my videos. And without further ado, let's dig right into it. Let's start with a small overview before we dig into the system. So most people will ask, I don't like this system. I check my tires regularly and it's always giving me problems and I don't understand it. Can I just disable it? Can I remove it? Can I just not worry about it? Well, the problem is this system is not put in Toyotas out of Toyota's goodness of heart. It is actually a federal requirement in the United States. It's not up to them to put it, it is required. As of 2008, it is a requirement in all Toyota models to have some sort of tire pressure monitoring. In Europe, this became mandatory around 2012, and around the world, each country will have its different regulations. So, now that you know that it's actually not up to us to disable it, you can't really disable it, you can just ignore it. It's not gonna, I doubt you will not pass inspection if it's not working, but that is up to your local municipality and their inspection regulations. Now that we cleared that up, I guess we're stuck with this system, so let's learn about it. Let's know the ins and outs of this system. So, how does the system work? Before we get to that, there are two types of tire pressure monitoring system. There is direct and there is indirect. Let's start with the indirect, since it is the ancient and the one that you're not going to see anymore in modern Toyotas, at least the real Toyotas. Let's put it this way. So the indirect tire pressure monitoring system, it uses the input from the four wheels for the ABS. In case you didn't know this, for the anti-lock brakes, there is a wheel speed sensor at every wheel, measures the speed of the wheel, nothing fancy about that. So it checks the speed of the wheel. Now when the tire drops low, the circumference of the tire is going to drop as well. So there's going to be a difference in wheel speed, and it's going to pick on that and say, oh, wait a minute, that tire is low, and it's going to turn on the light. It's not going to know how low it is. It's not going to know where it is low. It's not going to know any of that stuff. But the inaccuracy of that system is what made way for the direct TPMS light sensor, because for the indirect ones, and the ones that you're going to deal with that are indirect, like 2005 to 2007 Toyota Highlander, for example, those had an indirect system. It was horrible. It had a lot of problems. And it just didn't really work all that well. Most people just ignored it, reset the light, forgot about it. Because if you inflate all your tires at 100 PSI, which is very bad, the tire light will not turn on. If you deflate all your tires to 10 PSI, which is very low, it'll also not turn on. The only way it'll turn on is if you have one tire that is lower than the rest. So that doesn't really help very much, and that's why we moved into the direct system. Now the direct system has 4 sensors and sometimes 5 for the spare tire, the 5th one. The sensor looks like this. This is your valve stem right here. If I can get this open. This is your valve stem right there. This goes through your wheel, you fill the tire from here, and lo and behold, behind it there is a sensor. We're going to talk about this sensor a little bit more in a bit. But very simple, uses 4 sensors. Sensor has a little battery, it's inside the tire, it's measuring actual tire pressure, just like your tire gauge. So these sensors communicate with a little device called a receiver. That receiver on most Toyota models is put on the C-pillar. It is also shared with your wireless remote. So every time you hit lock, unlock, that's the same receiver that receives the signal from these sensors. Really not very complicated. It's a genius system. It used the receiver that was already there to just pick up 4 signals from 4 sensors, and there you go. Now if you set your tire at say 100 psi, it's gonna know that's 100 psi. And if their tire drops to 10 psi, it's gonna know it's 10 psi. Even if 4 tires are 10 psi, it's gonna know we have 4 low tires because it's actually measuring pressures. Let's talk about this sensor for a bit. And this sensor, there's a love-hate relationship with these sensors. Look folks, when this system works, it's great. You know, you wake up that one morning, tire light is on, your tire is low, you have a flat, or you're going on a long trip, now it alerted you, you go check the pressures, oh yeah, I got a nail in the tire, let's get it fixed. That's when the thing works right. But that's usually not always the case. I'm not saying the system is not reliable, but it does have its issues. There's one more thing that needs repair and misdiagnosis all the time and all the stuff that comes with it. These sensors have a little battery inside of them, and you can actually see that battery right there. If the camera can focus right, you can see that battery, but you can't replace it. This battery is not replaceable. There's like a glue thing all over it. It's not meant to be replaced. So essentially, when this battery dies, this sensor, you take it out, throw it in the garbage, get a new one. That's just how this thing works. There's nothing around that. Sure, you can try digging into this and get a battery, but I wouldn't. It's not worth it. Now, the battery life on these sensors, it is said to be 10 to 15 years. We've seen some fail at 5 years, and we've seen some really get that long and they're still fine. So expect 10 to 15 years the average life of these batteries, but sometimes they actually last longer, but sometimes they won't last that much, not even close. Now, the thing about these sensors is they're motion activated. So let's say you park your car for 6 months. These sensors will turn off on their own, and they have a little centrifugal sensor. So when you start driving the car and this sensor is spinning with the wheel, it's going to pick that up and wake up the sensors. Or another way that these sensors can be woken up, if you drop the pressure on them, more than 5 to 10 psi usually is enough to wake them up. That passage of pressure over them will wake them up. That's how these things work, and that's very important to know when you have a problem with this system, because you could simply deflate the tires 10 psi, raise them back up, and these things will wake up, and now everything is working. That happens a lot. There are actually 2 types of this sensor, and I know we're kind of going into this too deep, but bear with me here. The 2 types of this sensor, this is the good old 2007, 2008 one, works great, life is good, but this one has a lot of problems, and which those problems led to the development of the new one. Unfortunately, I don't have the new one to show you because it's too new. It actually came out around 2018. But let's talk about the problems with this one, and then you'll see why they developed the new one. The problems with this one is this tip. Now, when you go remove these sensors, they're notorious to seize up, and then this little stem part snaps off the plastic part. Now the plastic part goes flying off. That's it. There's no, you can glue them, but remember, this is moving with the tire. It's gonna come unglued. You need a new sensor. And what happens also is, if you live in the beautiful Rust Belt, like I do in Chicago, the valve tip right here inside, where you fill it up with air, seizes up. Now you turn it, it breaks. Now you need a valve stem. But since the valve stem is part of the sensor, now you need a new sensor. So there's actually a little tip. Very important that you always have a cap on these sensors, because they will rust on you and you're going to end up not being able to fill the tire, or you can't remove this, and you can't even remove the sensor out. You're going to end up having to replace the sensor. So having a cap on it at all times is a very good idea. So because of these problems, Toyota decided, wait a second, why don't we just make the stem part separate from the sensor? And that's the new style sensors. Around 2018 is when they came out. So the stem is made out of rubber, so it doesn't corrode as much as this one does. and you can separate it from the sensor. So if this tip has a problem, you can replace the tip separate from the whole sensor, of course at a much lower cost. These sensors, they're not very expensive, but times 4, they get a little annoying, their price, because now you add labor to replace them and programming and all that. It just gets a bit much for something that's not that essential to be dumping that much money into it. Speaking of programming, Toyota, they make great cars. They possibly one of the most reliable cars that there are, but sometimes they have things that are a little behind the rest of the crowd. They're ahead in reliability, leaps and bounds ahead, but not in some stuff. This is one of them. So every time you replace this sensor before 2018, you have to come see me at the dealership, and usually dealerships will charge you a good amount of money to program these. You can't program them otherwise. Yes, some aftermarket scan tools, you can program them with it, life is good, but you do need a scan tool. You can't just, like other manufacturers, replace the sensor, life is good, we're moving on, we don't have to worry about it, it'll automatically program. Because all the computer will do is, in 2018 and up Toyotas or some other manufacturers, it'll look at the signal. Hey, I have this sensor that's always there, and the sensor I'm looking for is not always there. So guess what? I'm going to assume this is my sensor, and I'm going to start listening to it and move on. It's a very simple idea. Toyotas, they don't do that. So this sensor has a number, an ID number, and it's actually on the original sensor. It's printed on the sensor itself. Printed right here, as you can see in this picture. Now, this picture is just for reference. They'll be using that number. Please don't use that number. Every sensor will have its own identification number. Now, that identification number is what you're going to program into the scan tool so the car would start listening to it. It's very simple, not really a time-consuming process with the right scan tool, but again, dealerships are open for business. They're going to charge you, and it gets annoying when you have one sensor failed. You paid to replace it. 3 months later, another one failed, and another one, and another one, because after all, 4 of these sensors were replaced the day the car was made, and they're the same age. If one fails, the rest are not much behind. But I never recommend you actually replace 4 if you have one bad one, because sometimes you get a bad one and then 2 years later the next one goes. There's no rhyme or reason to it, but I wouldn't just jump ahead and do all 4 at the same time. Let me sum up some things that are relevant to you as an owner, whether you've never worked on your car or you are that extreme DIY mechanic that does everything from engine rebuilds and everything. Here's the summary of what I've learned over a decade working on these cars. These sensors, I already talked about the programming, so if you have a bad one, replace it, go to the dealership, get it programmed, be done with it. But don't buy aftermarket ones. And from my understanding, and I don't work in the aftermarket, so this is just my general understanding of the aftermarket. There are aftermarket sensors you can buy. Apparently there are 2 styles of aftermarket sensors. One of them is just a copy of this guy, also has a code, ID code. You can program it. They never work right because they're universal. They're meant for 10 different manufacturers. They're not meant for Toyota, and the Toyota system is a little bit sensitive to these things. Usually what happens to the aftermarkets is you put the sensor in, it works, a month later it stops. You got to reprogram it and reprogram it and reprogram it. And it gets very annoying. The other type, apparently, of aftermarket sensors is the ones that are clones. So you put that sensor and you program somehow, I don't know honestly how this works. To me, put this or don't put anything else, but it copies the number of the original one, the one that was bad in the car, and it starts broadcasting that ID number. It's basically impersonating the old sensor. These work a little bit better, but they still don't work very well. Folks, these sensors, if you shop online, you can find them cheaper than the dealership or even the dealership price. Yeah, it gets much if you're replacing more than one, but if you're going to spend the money to program them, get an original one. Don't gamble with the aftermarket ones that just keep not working. And yes, if someone has good experience with aftermarket, I am extremely happy for that. But from my experience, I see people coming in, they spend a fortune on an aftermarket one, and guess what? It doesn't work. You just wasted your money. Let's start all over from scratch. So I'm just letting you know. One more thing about the tire light itself. Well, there are two things about the tire light that you absolutely need to know about. First, when you first start your car, the light, if it comes on, stays on solid, that means your tire light is on. If you start your car and the light starts flashing, on, off, and then eventually it stays on solid, that means there is a problem with the system. Either the sensor is not working, the receiver is not working, something is wrong, there are trouble codes that are set, and that needs diagnosis. Because I see so many people coming to the dealership, oh, my tire light is on, could you just adjust my pressures? Well, I go turn the car on, guess what, it's flashing. That's not going to work. Few things on the flashing light though. If you have your pressure, say 150 psi, that could cause the tire light to start flashing, because then this sensor can't read that high and it just assumes it's not reading and it's going to start flashing the light. So yes, do check your pressure for extreme pressures, for flat tire or 150 psi. But if your pressures are normal and the light is flashing, likely you got a problem, and that problem is likely with one of these sensors. The receivers, yes, they could have an issue, but it is very rare, and usually that issue is accompanied by your remote not working, because they're the same unit. If something is wrong with that unit and it's not picking these up, likely your remote doesn't work either. So there's that. The new style sensors, 2018 and up. Welcome to the 21st century, Toyota, and thank you for doing this. These sensors, if you have a 2018 and up, and not all 2018s by the way, primarily 2018 Camry, 19 RAV4, and the new generation of Toyotas, the ones that you can distinguish them with a rubber valve stem. This is not a rubber one. The rubber one is black, it's rubber, you can move it. That's the new style sensors, and thank you, Toyota, again, for moving to the 21st century when it comes to these guys. That's style sensors. You just put the sensor on, go drive the car, 20, 30 miles an hour, voila! It's programmed on its own and life is good. You can still manually program it if you don't want to do that drive with the light flashing potentially, but for DIY mechanics, you go buy this guy at the dealership, install it in your car, have a nice day. You don't have to pay a guy like me to program them. Just letting you know so you wouldn't go wasting your money there. Now, another thing with these sensors, when you go replacing a sensor, there's something called a fit kit, which has a rubber seal, little washer, and a nut. Now, the new sensor also comes with the rubber seal. So if you're replacing the new sensor, you're going to toss this guy out because it already comes with the sensor. This goes through the wheel. This washer goes in over the wheel, and then you're going to use this nut to tighten it up. Some of these sensors, they're going to be 11 millimeters. Some of them will be 12 millimeters, and some of them will be either or. It's just the size for them. Don't over tighten these. Always find the torque spec. Because if you over tighten this, guess what's going to happen? You're going to snap it and it's going to break the sensor, because this sensor actually, when you tighten this, it rests against the wheel. You over tighten it, it's just going to break it. Be careful with these when you replace them, folks, DIY folks, and always replace the fit kit. And the biggest thing is, when you go to tire shops, they'll be like, oh, do you want to buy the rubber seal kit, la, 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 and we're going to charge you $50 to save your life. Please don't do that. If you don't live in the Rust Belt where things are very rusty, don't worry about them. These seals right here, they last a long time. And you know what I see always happening? You have perfectly fine seals that were not leaking. You go to a tire shop, they put their cheap generic, God knows where they got them from, very cheap, seals on, and then those will start leaking in a year. Just letting you know. These seals last a very long time unless there's rust that builds up around it on the wheel that pushes the seal and makes it leak. The dealerships will only sell you the fit kit, which comes these 3 pieces. Here's how it looks in the bag. It's a few bucks. It's not really the end of the world. I would actually buy that original seal. I'd rather you leave the seal if it's not leaking, or put the original seal that comes with the fit kit of the tire pressure monitoring sensor. Let's talk about the most important thing with this video. All this information you could have known, found out, read about somewhere, but let's talk about the most misunderstood thing in this entire system. The button. In the indirect system, in the older cars, like I told you, 05 to 07 Highlander and some others around that time, if you have a light and you have rubber valve stems in the older cars, you don't have tire pressure monitor, or if you have a light, you have it indirect. There's a reset button, and most people don't understand what that reset button does. In the indirect system with no sensors, you press that button and hold it, the light will turn off. That just did a soft reset. Just turned it off, it's going to look at the pressures again. But then if you press it and hold it and continue to hold it, it's going to flash 3 times. Then it's going to go off. That did a hard reset. You do that on these indirect ones every time you replace your tires, for example, or you fix a flat, or you want the system to recheck everything from the get-go, not just the pressures. Do that every time you replace tires. If it's giving you trouble on the indirect ones, do that reset, call it a day, we're good. The biggest problems and misconceptions with this system is it comes when you have a reset button with sensors. And that's the problem. Let's talk about that for a bit. So all that button does is set something called the threshold. It does not reset anything. The sensors are always sending their pressures. So here's how that button actually works. You press it, press and hold it. It'll flash 3 times, then it'll turn off. All you did there was you told the computer, whatever my pressures are right now, I want the light to come on at 5 to 6 psi below that number. Wait, what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what that means. Your tires are set, let's say 35 psi. Okay? When do you want that light to come on? Do you want it to come on at 32? Do you want it to come on at 30? At 27? 25? You can set that up, actually. That's called the low tire threshold. How low does a tire need to be for the system to turn on the light? And consider it a low tire. And what you do, when you press that button and hold it and it flashes 3 times, on the cars with this sensors, you set that threshold. So what you want to do is not be resetting that light every time you do anything with tires. No. The first time, you're setting it up. You set your tires at what you want them. Let's say 32 psi. Seems to be most Toyotas. Some of the newer ones are 35, 36, but let's say 32 psi. You're going to press that button, set your tires 32, press that button, hold it. It's going to flash 3 times. Then it's going to set the low tire pressure to come on every time your tires go to 27 psi. Do you catch my drift there? It has nothing to do with resetting anything. It doesn't really reset anything. The indirect one did, but the new ones, they don't. Hence why the very newest cars, the Toyota figured, let's remove this button. We're spending money putting them in, most people misusing it and not really using it the right way. So they took them out. Some of the newer cars don't even have them anymore. So if you have that button, now you know what it does. So if your light starts flashing, don't go pressing that button the first thing and hoping for the best, because it ain't gonna do anything. The thing is though, if you have a car that the light is on, you set the pressures at 32 psi, that's the recommended pressure, you go drive it and the light's still on. Somebody could have set the threshold to wrong. Somebody could have put the tires at 40 psi, set the threshold, now the light will come on at 35, he set it at 32, which is the right thing, it still sees it as low. That's just how the system is programmed to work. It's only going to work as good as the information it has. So if you have a stubborn tire light that doesn't want to turn off, even though you set the pressures, you're driving and driving, try to use the button. And people will ask, wait a minute, what if I don't have the button? Then your only choice is to use a scan tool. Toyota scan tool works. That's the only way you can do it to reset these thresholds if your car doesn't have the button. So guys, this is all the information about these systems. They can be great when they work, but they can be very frustrating when they don't. And most people tend to ignore them, forget them, and I don't blame you. I hope your local municipality doesn't require it as part of a yearly inspection or whatever. Folks, don't spend too much money on this guy. Sure, we'd love our cars to be perfect and running. If we rely on this system, fix it, but don't make it a priority over maintenance, over important repairs. Don't spend too much money on this guy. Last but not least, some cars, some Toyota models, namely 2011 to 2019 Sienna. These are some of the most stubborn tire lights for some reason. I'm just going to give you a warning, if you would. These cars, you had a flat tire, light is on, you fix the flat, whatever, set the tires, life is good, tire light's still on. You really have to drive it for a long time for them to pick up and turn the light off. They just take a very long time. There's not going around it. So be patient if you have one of these vans. There are some other models that are a little bit, also take a little bit long, but the Sienna seems to be the worst one for time. There's no problem, just drive it around. Eventually they'll pick up and they'll go off. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it was informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, subscribe to the channel. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have a wonderful day.